We are now going to add poll to refresh on the table view so that on a poll it will refresh the expenses from the iCloud data.
To start doing a poll to refresh, you first need the UI element. That UI element, and we're going to do it in a constant here, it's called a refresh control. And you create a refresh control by accessing UI, refresh control, and initializing that. Once you have the refresh control, you actually need to tell the table view that wants to pull the refresh, that the refresh control belongs to that. So in the table view, in the view did load, let's access the table view, which is expenses table view, access its refresh control, and set our refresh control to our refresh control. Once we do that, we now have the ability to build and run this application and pull to refresh that table. Ultimately, though, when we do that, it actually doesn't do anything. We need to give it a function or a target to call when the user actually pulls to refresh. So to provide a target to a UI refresh control, you need a function. So let's go down below query expenses and create a new function. Dale, what should this function be called?
Refresh expenses.
Refresh expenses. It's not going to take in any parameters. It's not going to return anything. It's simply going to be refresh expenses. And let's query expenses in here. To give this refresh control this function to call, though, this function has to be exposed to Objective-C. So how do I expose this function to Objective-C, Dale?
At objc.
At objc. And this simply tells the Swift compiler that this needs to be visible to Objective-C code. Now that we've done that, we can actually add this function as the target for a refresh control. So navigate back up to the view did load. Let's access our refresh control, and let's call a function on it called add target. Target's going to be self, and the action, this is the function that it needs to call, and we're going to provide it what's called a selector. A selector, and even you can see that with autocomplete, takes in an objc, Objective-C, method. So we are going to pass it our refresh expenses function, and for the control event of .value changed. At this time, if I build and run it, it will actually query our CloudKit database for the new records. And let's even prove that by going to the CloudKit dashboard, accessing our container, going to data, and actually creating a new expense via the CloudKit dashboard. So click create new expense and enter the fields required. So amount, let's say
1995.
1995.
Today or whenever.
At
11/11.
Ooh, 11/11.
11. And we're buying dishes as seen on TV.
Let's just say dishes.
Okay.
And I'm going to click save. The object's been created. We can even query the database here. We have all of our expenses, and if we expand this one, we have 1995 amount named dishes. So now when I build and run this again, we see it. I'm going to add another object. 2195, 2017, 11/11, add 11/11/11, name even more dishes. So this object's actually being created after our simulator's already fetched our records. So we won't see it pop up until the user actually pulls to refresh. And let's do the pull to refresh right now. And boom, it just appeared. Even more dishes. But Dale, do you see a problem with this?
We need to tell the little spinner to go away. So I imagine we need some way to tell the control that we're done with it.
Exactly. So to make the spinner go away, we need to access our refresh control and tell it to end. So we need to kind of modify our query expenses function to allow for this. And we're going to create a new parameter. And let's call this parameter completion handler. This completion handler is going to be of a optional closure. So let's put some parentheses and a question mark, meaning it's going to be optional. And it's not actually going to take in any parameters. And it's not even going to return parameters. So it's simply a function with no parameters and no return value. So now that we have this completion handler, let's navigate down into our private database perform statement, past our if let errors, past our reload data, and let's call our completion handler that was passed in. So to call a closure as a parameter, you access the parameter name. Since this is optional, we have to put a question mark and then do parentheses. What this says is if the completion handler exists, call it. Else, do not call it. So now we actually need to provide our query expense function calls with completion handlers. So in refresh expenses, I'm going to delete what we had, type query expenses again, and we have a completion handler. Since this is the last parameter and it is a closure, this can be a trailing closure. And to do that, I'm just simply going to double click. And we have that. And in here, I'm going to access a refresh control and tell it to end refreshing. We still have one more error, and that's because we gave a parameter to our query expenses, and we have not actually provided a parameter up here in the view did load where we call it. So it says, hey, do you want to fix this missing argument? I'm going to click fix. And instead of actually giving this a completion handler of nothing, I'm going to give it a completion handler of nil. So now when I build and run this, our queries are working, but let's add another value, create new record, amount $23.95 at 11:11 again. And what should the name be, Dale?
Oh, I need a mouse.
And I'm going to click save. Our record has now been saved to CloudKit, and I can prove that by querying the database, accessing our expense, amount $23.95, name mouse, and let's prove that our refresh control works over here. Notice how mouse does not appear. I'm going to pull to refresh. Notice how mouse is there, and even our refresh control disappears.